My name's Rachel Coker. I'm in the Division of Research, and this is part of our series of professional development workshops that we're presenting during the shutdown period. Today, we're going to be talking about how to present better webinars and how to take your presentation and make it into a smoother webinar. While everyone's getting signed in, I'll give you a minute to test your microphones. You're welcome to leave yourselves on mute if you prefer, or to connect your audio if you'd like to ask a question. The agenda for today, we're going to be talking about some problems that people run into with webinars, some ideas about how to fix them, and finally, we're going to talk about how you can get some feedback. While everyone's getting settled, I'm going to go ahead and launch a poll. Take a minute to respond to that question when you get a chance. If you're just joining us, again, my name's Rachel Coker. I'm in the Division of Research. Thank you for joining me for today's presentation. We're going to be talking about how to make your webinar a better and smoother experience for yourself and for your participants. We'll be addressing some problems that people experience with webinars, some ideas about how to fix those problems, and also how you can go about getting some feedback on the presentations that you give. If you've just joined us, you can go ahead and answer the poll question that's up in front of you. What's wrong with webinars? All right, it looks like almost everyone has given us their feedback here. We have rival top answers. Problems that people have encountered during webinars include technical challenges and a lack of participation. A strong second place behind them, or third place, I suppose that makes it, for an unclear agenda. And last place, but also for sure an issue for a lot of webinars, is poor leadership or facilitation. So let's go ahead and get started. I'll end the poll there and share the results so you all can see what I was looking at. Oh, someone must have buzzed in at the last second with an extra vote for technical challenges. All right, fair enough. Back to our agenda here. So again, we're going to be talking about some problems people experience with webinars, some ideas about how to fix those issues, and finally, some ways that you can get feedback on the talks that you give. I just outlined some common issues that people experience. I know I have been on numerous webinars since the shutdown began. People who can't remember how to take themselves on and off of mute, large groups where people don't use mute, issues where people's video or audio is unclear, a lack of participation, sometimes just the lack of eye contact in this format is a challenge for presenting. Poor leadership or facilitation. You know, not every meeting lends itself to this format. Certainly not every talk lends itself to this format. But that's an added challenge if the person who is in charge of the meeting isn't well prepared to begin with. And certainly, just like in any meeting, you know, an agenda or an objective that's unclear will certainly drag down the experience. Other issues you all have experienced, I'll give you a moment if there's something you'd like to share on top of that, whatever you voted for your other in our little poll. Issues you've run into. Anyone like to jump in there? All right, I'll go ahead and keep going.
Oh, hey, Rachel.
Oh, yes.
Hey, it's Kevin Betcher. Sorry, I'm watching a toddler as I say this. So one of the other things I've noticed with this is that a lot of discussions can kind of get recursive because there's a conversation happening in the chat that's totally separate than what's happening kind of in the meeting. And so trying to kind of stay motivated, moving forward, focus on kind of the goals can be a challenge, I've noticed.
Fair enough. I think that the chat is just one of the many distractions facing meeting participants in this format, where if you were in a conference room, you would be able to tell if people's attention was wandering, or if a side conversation got going and people were writing notes to each other, you could wait or ask them, put them on the spot and say, what's happening? With the chat feature in Zoom especially, there can be a lot of those side conversations and the presenter is not necessarily aware of it. Certainly we all have other distractions at our fingertips, whether that's your phone or a child or the television, other windows on your own computer. I think multitasking is a challenge for sure. So let's talk about some ways that we can set the stage for a better experience. I think one key that we've tried to incorporate into a lot of the research town halls is that I give instructions and I repeat those instructions. So I'll often start the meeting early, and while people are signing in, explain, I'm going to put everyone on mute, but you are welcome to take yourself off of mute if you have a question. You're welcome to use the chat feature to ask a question, and try to repeat that as people are signing in. So again, the amount of time that you need to spend on those instructions and even what those instructions are may change. Today, we have a relatively intimate group. There's 16 people on the call right now. Even if everyone had themselves off of mute, it would probably not be overwhelming. On a call with 150 people, you really want to assert some kind of control over the audio, or it can get away from you. So it's worth, for yourself too, deciding, do you want to be interrupted? Are you ready for people to take themselves off mute and talk when they want to? Would you rather see things in the chat? There's different possibilities. And in fact, a note to myself, I did not have the chat window up. I was looking at as many of your faces as I could at once. And now I see that Kristen had also commented, too many people talking at once can become a problem. And that's absolutely the case. So one possibility is to leave on the lines unmuted in small groups, mute participants in larger groups. That sometimes will be easier to do if you have someone serving as a moderator in addition to your presenter. So very often on the Wednesday calls that the Division of Research is facilitating, I'll serve as a moderator and other people are presenting the information. So if you have someone you can tag team with, a team member who can back you up and keep an eye on that chat, maybe keep an eye on your time that's lapsed, that's helpful as well. Another suggestion is that you can prepare the people who are on the call that you're going to be calling on them. Get them ready to interact with you. Set that stage early on. So today you've already responded to a poll. Kevin already jumped in with a comment. Ideally, you want to encourage that kind of back and forth, at the beginning of the webinar and set that stage so that also tells people, oh, maybe I shouldn't get my phone out and start playing Candy Crush. Maybe I need to make sure that I'm alone in the room so that if the presenter calls on me, I'm ready to respond. And again, back to that issue of an unclear or unfocused agenda or a lack of an objective. I think displaying an agenda at the beginning of the meeting and possibly returning to it is also helpful. I'll stop here and see, does anyone else have any suggestions for how you can set expectations early in the call, ways that you can set the stage for a good meeting? You're welcome to type it in the chat or to take yourself off mute if you'd like.
Yeah, I'd just add, having run, I think back in March, some very disastrous meetings, I learned the value of actually sending around the agenda beforehand that people can have as an external document too. Just because, you know, sometimes you put the agenda up first, somebody doesn't come in until 5 minutes in, they've missed it. As opposed to having to go back to it a lot, I think having a copy elsewhere people can click on can be helpful too.
Absolutely. And Kristen has another good suggestion, which is that you can also have a slide that includes the instructions for how you're handling technology, so that if you see people joining the call late, you can come back to that slide and nudge people while you continue talking. Sure, that's another good way to do it. This also brings up the question of, you know, sort of what is a webinar? If you want to do what Kevin suggested and mail, or, you know, email people an agenda ahead of time, you need to know who's going to be in the meeting. That's not always possible. Sometimes these are more sort of open presentations. For today, for example, no one had to register. It was not really possible to know who would be on the call. So you do sometimes see people using Zoom for something that's more of a presentation and less of a working meeting. It can work well for both. And I would say either way, it doesn't hurt to share that agenda again right at the top of the meeting as you're getting started. Next up, you want to think about ways that you can engage your participants. And Zoom really gives you a lot of different features and a lot of possibilities here. If you want a small group, if you want people to have time for back and forth and that level of interaction, one simple thing, just like in a face-to-face meeting, would be to limit the size of the group. You know, if you wouldn't get 42 people around a table and expect them to all give you that back and forth and comments and feedback. But we do sometimes in Zoom end up in that situation where you have 42 people on the call. And if the moderator is intending to give everyone a time to jump in and make their comments, that can be really tough. And it also means that there's going to be some repetition and perhaps just some boredom. Oh, well, I've already shared my feedback. Now I'm waiting for the other 30 people to go ahead. So a smaller meeting will give you more of that opportunity for feedback and for Q&A. Perhaps you want to have 2 meetings then so that you can be working with a smaller group. Giving everyone some kind of task, an assignment, a question, a poll is another way of keeping people engaged. So if in Kevin's example, you're going to be meeting with a group, you've emailed the agenda ahead of time, you can give people an assignment. Okay, you're going to speak first, then turn it over to your colleague, call on a third person after that for their input, and have those folks know and be ready to jump in. You can ask questions instead of just providing information. And for some of you, you know, if you're used to teaching or if you're used to giving a lecture that's recorded ahead of time, you may need to remind yourself, oh, okay, here's a little break where I need to, you know, pause and see if there are questions. And, you know, again, taking those questions frequently or stopping and saying, you know, does anyone have feedback? Do you have other ideas about how to do this? What are some ways, for those of you on the call right now, what are some ways that you've seen people really encourage that kind of engagement, that back and forth? And here's where we can also talk about sharing video or not sharing your video. So no one on the call right now besides me, I think. Oh, there's a couple. Let's see. Caroline, I can see your camera. But that's another possibility. You know, you have the opportunity for some kind of eye contact, if not the kind of eye contact that you would have if you were sitting across the table from someone. but a little bit of visual information, right? So that's another possibility. Do you want to say up front, please leave your camera on so that we can pause and talk to each other throughout the talk? Or is it okay, you'll feel a little bit like you're alone in the room, but that the people on the call are, they're there, even if you can't hear or see them for chunks of time. Does anyone have something they'd like to add? Ways they've seen people who are giving a presentation keep people engaged in the call?
I think if your group size is small enough, then depending on the nature of the meeting that you're having, you could like individually go around the room and just say, give each person a chance to say something, even if they don't have anything to say at all.
Absolutely, and Corey in the chat is noting too, if it's a small enough group, especially if people don't know each other, you can ask people for introductions, go around the room as it were. One of my little bugaboos about Zoom is that of course we don't see each other in the same order. So that makes it a little hard. You can't tell really like, oh, am I next or am I, 14 people down the chart. But yeah, absolutely. You can go around the cloud and give everyone a moment to contribute that way too. Next up, I want to talk a little bit about, we focus sometimes on the limitations of Zoom. So this is going to, be a moment to talk about sort of some rules of radio and how Zoom is limited, but also then what we have going for us here. So if you've ever been interviewed on TV or talked to someone who does work, for film at all, you may have heard, oh, the camera adds 10 pounds, right? The sort of companion to that for radio is that when you're transmitting your voice like this, you're going to lose 10 or 20% of the clarity of the sound. So if you're not speaking clearly or you have some kind of a challenge with your audio input to begin with, you can expect that delivering a webinar is going to further reduce that. So you want to do everything you can to set the stage for success there. You can record a call. You can launch your personal meeting room on Zoom and record and then listen back. That's a good way of getting an idea of what your audience will be able to hear. You can set up a quick test call with a colleague and say, let me know. I'm hearing a lot of lawnmower noise today from my neighbor's yard. Is that distracting to you? Martha and I were on a call the other day and she was really bothered by some yard work going on in her neighborhood, but I couldn't hear it at all because she was using headphones. So think about how you can improve your audio setup. That means giving yourself every opportunity to hear. So reducing the noise, using earbuds or headphones if you need to. And that means if you're presenting, making sure that you have a good microphone setup. Because I've been doing so much with Zoom, I have purchased myself a ridiculous fancy microphone that makes me feel like I'm on Frasier. This is a little over $100. It's a Yeti microphone. Right now, you're going to find that it's a little bit of a difficulty to purchase a cheap web compatible microphone because there's been such a need for them lately. But the nice ones, the $100-ish ones, seem to still be pretty widely available. So that's an option for you as well. If you feel like your headphones aren't cutting it or the microphone on your laptop that's built in is not so great. Next up, think about the visuals. So today I am trying to use my laptop and have the webcam that's in my laptop pretty much at eye level. So I'm sitting down and I have my laptop on top of a box. You could keep a box handy that is a nice height. I recommend toner cartridge boxes seem to be a really excellent height, and sometimes you could turn them this way if you need a little more height to it. Stacks of books, which are readily available all over campus and in almost everybody's office, allow you to, you can adjust by a couple of inches here and there using books as well. but get it to a height that's nice. And I'm going to give you a quick example. If you haven't played with this yourself, you know, a pour height. This is me presenting on my desk. You're going to get more of the like up my nose angle. You know, it's not as flattering, and it also leaves me kind of looking down at the web camera. Terrible is also, you know, this kind of a thing where you're chopping off too much of your head. You also have the hostage video situation where the camera is really too low and you end up with a lot of ceiling in your shot. So you want to avoid all of that where you can. And spending just a couple seconds as you're getting ready for a call will pay off nicely there for you. I'm sitting at the edge of a desk. It's not the most comfortable spot for me to work in, but it's definitely the nicest visual to have behind me. And so for giving a talk like this, I've prioritized a clean background behind me over some other possibilities. On the topic of clean backgrounds, I want to just say, if you're in your office and you're sitting in front of a window like this, although you might enjoy the sort of halo effect, it's pretty tough for your audience to see you, and just not as flattering light and not as easy to take in. So I like to say you want to avoid having a window really anywhere in the shot if you can, not to the side of you, not behind you for sure. Facing a window, on the other hand, will give you a nice even light coming onto your face. So that's a possibility. Some people like to put a lamp actually on the other side of their computer. So if you have a light, then your laptop or webcam, and then yourself, that will also ensure that you're not sitting kind of in shadow while you're giving a talk. Does anyone have questions about the audios or visual kind of tips that I just talked about? Any other good hints for us on how to look your best? Another tip that I've borrowed from Martha, and I made sure I followed my own rules today, is that, you know, if you were posing for a photo, we would recommend solid colors. You definitely, for video, want to avoid stripes. So, you know, a solid color blazer, a solid color shirt. I left my really giant earrings at home today. You know, simplify there and let people focus on the message. People will be able to see you and not be distracted. If you want, and you're on Twitter, you can look at Room Rater. I think the handle is Rate My Skype Room. They actually give people points and scores for a lot of TV commentators. And it's been interesting to see their suggestions for how people can improve the setting behind them on screen. They are the ones who say, oh, you know, this kind of a setup where you see the top of someone's head and a lot of their ceiling. They've been saying, you know, it looks like, you know, Cory Booker, have you been taken hostage? Are you okay out there? So it's been interesting to see that. Kristen's asking in the chat about virtual backgrounds. Caroline Pasquale, who's on the call today, is using a virtual background, I think, very effectively. She works in the Center of Excellence. She has a really strong photo of the building, and it's nice to set the scene. She also has hair that is cooperating with her virtual background. Myself, with curly hair, what ends up happening is that sometimes it crops to the very edge of my face and it looks like I'm bald. Other times the curls come through and are kind, you see like half of my hair. It's an interesting thing. So 2 things about virtual backgrounds. Test it out first and see how you like it, see what it looks like for you personally. And also it does take some bandwidth. So if you're working from home on a given day and you're making a presentation, you know, if you have incredible Wi-Fi and no one else is using it and you feel comfortable, you've got the bandwidth to spare, fine. you're on campus and you know we've got this great connection, no big deal. But if you're working from home, and like me, there are sometimes 2 other teenagers, you know, on various devices, or people are streaming 2 different movies while you're doing your Zoom call, I'd steer clear. Other questions or comments, tips that you've seen on better video or better audio for these calls? So I also want to talk for just a second about the visuals that you might be using in your slide deck. Now, if we're just having a meeting without slides, we're getting together, it's 6 of us, we're working on a topic, and no one came to this meeting with anything they had to present. That's different, right? That's not really a webinar to me. That's a meeting, a working group getting together. And you're not going to need to worry so much about the visuals that are going to be on the screen. You're going to just worry about, okay, is my Zoom box clear? Can people see me all right? But if you are giving a presentation like I am today, and you have a slide deck, you want to take a minute and think about the visuals. You know, perhaps take the time to find some graphics that will support your messaging. You can tap into photography from around campus, perhaps. Martha and I would definitely caution against the old Google search followed by a right click. You know, you might get away with fair use, but it's not great practice. We're here on a university campus. We mean to, you know, respect people's intellectual property, and photography and graphics are someone's intellectual property. So I will purchase stock illustrations if I need to for a certain topic, use some of the photo assets that the university has. And if you've wondered kind of how you can get your hands on some of those, the campus photographer, Jonathan Cohen, does have a Flickr stream. And so that's a great place to find some, you know, professional quality photography that you can download for free very easily and access no matter where you're working. Another suggestion in terms of capitalizing on Zoom is that you do have an opportunity to bring in other voices more easily than you might have otherwise. If you were giving a presentation at Binghamton University a year ago to a room full of people, you probably would have tried to have you know, a co-presenter join you physically in the room. And I know many people on this call have spent time, you know, coordinating seminars and what day is going to work well for people. And, oh, this day works really well for Dr. Patel, but Dr. Smith won't be free. So we need to have it the following Wednesday instead. In the land of Zoom, you know, people have to be free literally for the time that they're presenting. They don't have to fly to Binghamton. They don't have to drive here from New York City. And so, you know, see about bringing in other voices. Perhaps if you are giving a talk, you are able to say, okay, I'm going to divide up the time with one other person so that people don't get tired of my voice. It's another possibility. Kevin has a good point in the chat. He notes that in Google image search, you can filter for images that have a Creative Commons license. And that's a great tip as well, so that you could be using visuals legally, but with a broader base to search on. The visuals that I'm using today are part of a royalty-free pack called Black Illustrations. So that's a new set that I found recently, and this seemed like a good opportunity to use them and see how they work. Next up, you want to think about how you're going to pace your presentation. You know, you want to find a way to give people a break now and then. Some of us are planning webinars later this summer where people might be on a call for 3 hours at a go. I think you're still going to need to provide that time. You know, if you were in person, you know, on campus for a meeting, we probably would not have sat, you know, okay, you're gonna go into the seminar room, sit down at 9 a.m. and we're not letting you stand up until noon. No, you would absolutely have expected that people needed to get up and use the bathroom, get a cup of coffee, have a snack. And those things are still true in the land of Zoom. So perhaps you want to say, you know, put up a slide and say, coffee break, you know, everyone meet me back here in 5 minutes. It is different. People are at home, people are in their offices. You do have the possibility of losing their attention at those breaking points. But, you know, you're going to lose their attention if you just keep talking for 3 hours also. I've seen some people who create more slides than they might have for an in-person presentation so that they can change what the visuals are. And that's a possibility as well. You can, if you know that there are people who have a lot of questions, or if you feel like people are going to want to give you their very individual, oh, but what about this? Or what if this case happens? You know, you might consider establishing a time after the webinar. The formal presentation is over, but I'm going to stick around for your questions, or come back at 2 o'clock this afternoon. I'll be having office hours and you can ask your individual questions at that time. So there might be another way to create an opportunity for some follow-up as well. Other thoughts from any of you about how you've been pacing things differently? Thoughts about your tolerance for a Zoom that goes more than an hour?
Hi, Rachel. This is Mike Jacobson. I've been on a couple virtual conferences, and they've had the presenters pre-record their presentations, and then people watch the recordings before they have the actual webinar. And so when the webinar occurs, I guess it's expected that people have seen the recordings, and then that just opens it up to a discussion of the presentation.
Interesting. Yeah, sort of like a flipped course. Watch the lecture ahead and then come for a talk.
Yeah.
Okay.
So one of the experiences I have had, and it reminds me a lot of back when I was teaching, one of the things I was told is that, you know, the average instructor, when they say any questions, waits about 3 seconds or 4 seconds. I forget what it is, but people move on very quickly. And I've noticed with Zoom in particular, you know, that silence when you ask people for comment or to raise questions or anything like that feels like an eternity. And so I've learned I really have to discipline myself, and I explicitly talk about how long I'm waiting often as a way to sort of get through that. But often, you know, people don't have questions. They're trying to unmute themselves. They're trying to, you know, click to some other window. And so there's often a delay on top of the typical sort of, you know, waiting time. But that has just been a real particular one for me.
That's a good reminder too, that it does take time. It's not as instantaneous as looking around the room for people raising their hands. And that as a presenter, you're going to need to get comfortable with a tiny bit, at least, of uncomfortable silence, for sure. That's a good reminder. Thank you. All right. Last but not least, I want to say that you want to solicit some feedback toward the end of your talk, or even after the talk has ended. That could be taking a survey, send people something quick using Google Forms or SurveyMonkey. One nice thing that I saw recently was that participants in a webinar received an email with a link to a recording of the talk, as well as the slide deck and even a one-page sort of tip sheet that summarized what they had heard. And then in the body of that same email, we're asked, oh, you know, do you have any suggestions? We'd love to hear from you. And then don't just ask for the feedback, of course, but actually use the feedback, incorporate it, take it to heart. And so some things that have been helpful to me along that line, I have my whole presentation printed out so that I can see it. So I know what the next slide is. There are some limitations on Zoom in terms of, you know, if you were in presentation mode, normally on PowerPoint, you could be set up where you were seeing a little preview of the next slide. Zoom doesn't really let that happen. I know people who use 2 computers so that they can always have their slides open on a second screen. So that's one possibility. For me, low tech, I'm in my 40s. I just printed, this is only 9 slides today. So I literally printed them out all in one view. So I had an idea of kind of where I was in the talk. If you're interested in the visual aspect of it and in improving your slides and the visuals in your slides, this book is fantastic. It's called Slideology. And it's written by one of the people who was on the team that worked with Al Gore on An Inconvenient Truth, which is kind of the OG PowerPoint, in my opinion, in terms of presentations for the public good or nonprofit presentations, I think. So with that said, I'm looking forward to hearing your questions and suggestions. Perhaps we have a few minutes here where we could share some things that are working well, things that you've seen that were terrible, but you had ideas about how to fix them. I'd love to hear.
Rachel, this is Martha. I have a suggestion. Is that okay?
Sure.
I attended a webinar recently, and they not only did they have the speaker, but they also had somebody that he introduced at the beginning that was the facilitator. So every slide also at the right-hand corner or one of the corners had the facilitator's name and email, and it was made clear that you could, instead of, if you didn't want to do the group chat, you can send an email to the facilitator if you had issues, and then that facilitator would help. So the speaker could continue on. So that's just a suggestion.
Yeah, yeah.
So that helped a lot.
Hi, Rachel, this is Kirsten. I just wanted to chime in. I was recently on a webinar that had like over 100 participants. It was sort of an info demo kind of a thing. They did take some questions, but one of the things that was nice is that there were a lot of questions that folks are putting in the chat. And so as part of the follow-up, the presenters, they actually answered those questions and summarized it. And I thought that was great. As some of the other folks had mentioned, sometimes you can get distracted when, you know, there's the content and the presenters got stuff going on and there's the chat going on at the same time. And so sometimes folks can benefit from those questions that are happening kind of concurrently. So that was just a suggestion or something that I really appreciate as an attendee, and something I'm considering incorporating into anything that I do in the future.
So they emailed them after the fact, or they kept a kind of running, oh, here are the questions coming in through the chat, and then we're going to answer them together?
It was summarized. I mean, they picked a few questions that they were able to answer within the allotment, but, you know, after they sent out the slide deck, the recording, and, you know, there were maybe 10 to 12 questions that were not answered during the call. So that was helpful.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Other tips from anybody? Things you've learned? Ideas about better audio, visual?
Hey, Rachel, I was just going to make a comment about eye contact. It's something I struggle with on Zoom calls and also in real life sometimes. When I'm talking, my eyes just tend to wander. But I do wonder if it's better to, when you're talking, to look at the screen, as you may have a tendency to do, where the person's face is, or to look at the camera that's, you know, just above the screen. Any thoughts on that? Like now I'm looking at the computer, now I'm looking at the camera. Does one or the other look better?
I mean, it definitely, if you want to seem like you're making eye contact with the people on the call, staring into your webcam is the way to go. I'm doing it right now. Unfortunately, if you have a slide deck, your own tendency is going to be to look at the bullets on your own slide, right? Or if you are talking to someone on the call, the trick is, okay, you know, right now, Katie Ellis is the bottom box on my screen. So if she's turned on her video and I feel like I'm looking at her, in fact, the rest of you will have the impression that I'm looking down. So that's a challenge, you know, in, hi, Katie. You know, for Katie to feel like I'm looking at her, I need to do what I'm doing right now, which is stare into my webcam. But in fact, I won't see Katie if I do that. So the reality is you probably are shifting back and forth a little bit as you talk. And I think that's okay. You know, I actually when I coached one of my kids who was giving a presentation online, I had little notes next to the webcam. One said, slow down. And one said, smile, with an arrow pointing right at the webcam. So, you know, if you find that that's a challenge for you and that you need a reminder, you know, no one will see those Post-its. Anything behind the camera, they don't know about. I've also seen people post their whole, you know, print out each slide and post it on the wall behind the computer so that they are looking up. You know, if I were looking up at the wall in my office right now, this is where my eyes appear, which probably to you may look more like I'm looking at you or looking up instead of this constant, you know, looking down.
So sorry, I need to shut up, but I have two things. So one of the other benefits to checking in and making it more interactive is, this happened to me, you can, especially in Zoom and some other platforms, when you're in presenter mode, you can see yourself talking at the bottom. So you can sometimes not know if your program has frozen. So I was literally talking over a slide for like 3 or 4 minutes before realizing that my internet connection had dropped out and I was talking to no one. So those little check-ins, those little moments, I think it's good to just kind of be aware that things are still kind of moving and working correctly. I'll say the other thing in terms of feedback that is a benefit and a curse of Zoom is you can record it, as we were doing today, and you can go back and review the tape, right? So that was a little bit horrifying for me when I have done that, because you realize that things you maybe wouldn't know. Normally, for instance, I realized I said every 15 seconds. I realized I was talking way faster than I thought. But that sort of experience, I think, was really you know, beneficial too. So
I agree.
You will see too much,
painful.
but it's a good thing. Yeah.
Painful, but also super helpful. And Katie, for years, taught public speaking, and I know that she and I have both sent so many students to the public speaking lab on campus. So you're exactly right, Kevin. Zoom lets us have, all of us, that experience that the public speaking lab has provided in the past of, oh, okay, here's really what I sound like and look like. For me, it's also been instructive. My face when I'm just listening to someone talk is not something that I was super aware of before. You know, thank God in a meeting, you're not usually looking into a mirror. And now with Zoom, you are more aware of, oh, what's my facial expression like, you know, when I'm just listening to someone else talk. Another thing I've seen for people who have a challenge projecting, you know, maybe your voice isn't as loud, or just you feel like you have a different kind of energy sitting down, is if you have a standing desk or if you have more boxes to pile up, to give yourself a try speaking, you know, from a standing position. Some people feel that they have a different energy standing up. Just like if you were in a classroom setting, very few of us would present sitting down to a classroom full of students. But then somehow on Zoom, that became the norm, right? You're at your desk, you're trying to monitor too many different things. You've got pieces of paper next to you. And so a lot of us got comfortable sitting down doing it. But it may be worth giving yourself a try and seeing, you know, with your feet planted and standing up, do you project better? You know, is your energy different? So that might be something to try as well. Any other feedback, thoughts, suggestions before we let each other go here? Well, thank you very much for joining us. I'll be posting the link to this presentation as well as to the slides. And yes, indeed, I did make you a one-page tip sheet because I love you. So all of those will be available on the Division of Research Coronavirus Updates page, either later this afternoon or certainly by tomorrow morning. So thanks so much.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Rachel.
Rachel.